Well, it's definitely a Stephen King novel. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me. So today I'm going to review Never Flinch, Stephen King's newest novel. It came out in the end of May 2025. And look, it's fine. It's good. It's a perfectly fine, good, decent novel. It's fun. It gets the job done. It's in some ways exactly what you expect from Stephen King. And I was disappointed. But I anticipated being disappointed. I kind of knew that he wasn't writing the book that I wanted him to write, and it lived up to those mediocre expectations, unfortunately. There's still a lot to enjoy about the book. I still had a really good time reading it, even though it wasn't what I wanted it to be. I think my disappointment partly came from the book, but also came from my side both. So let me talk about the things that disappointed me first, and then I'll get to the things that I liked. Because I do think there is a lot about this book that was fun to read, and it shows that King still knows what he's doing. So, my disappointments. The first disappointment is I really like Holly Gibney as a character. So, for those of you who don't know, Holly Gibney first appeared in the Bill Hodges trilogy that started with Mr. Mercedes, then Finders Keepers, and End of Watch, right? And she was like an administrative assistant in the very first one of those. And King realized how much he liked her character, and then her role got bigger and bigger and bigger until she started getting her own novels, the first of which being The Outsider, and then the novella If It Bleeds, followed by Holly, and now Never Flinch. And as a character, Holly is somewhat coded as neurodivergent. King doesn't use that language, but she's definitely written that way, and her interior life and the way she understands the world, the way she organizes her mind, the way she engages with reality, and the sort of interior processes that she has to go through in order to make sense of things going on around her, and how that plays into her ability to be really good at investigating and engaging in deductive reasoning. All those things are coded as neurodivergent. And because of that, because her world is so ordered, I really enjoy seeing Holly Gibney go against non-human antagonists, such as in The Outsider and in If It Bleeds. Because when you have a non-human antagonist, all of her knowledge and her skill and her abilities have nowhere to go, because she's facing someone or something that doesn't follow the rules, that doesn't follow any rules of normal human behavior. So all of her deductive abilities only will get her so far. She has to make leaps of faith. She gets challenged. She gets pushed in ways that human antagonists, even ones that are off their rocker, aren't going to challenge her, right? And so I knew going into this novel that there was going to be only human antagonists. Stephen King mentioned who the antagonists were, what the story was about, what the two plot lines were about. So anyone that has watched any of his interviews over the last maybe 9 months or so knew what the main antagonists were going to be of this novel. So I knew it was going to be boring human antagonists. And that's exactly what it was. And exactly as I feared, it didn't really let Holly shine. Like, it didn't challenge her in the ways that you saw in The Outsider or in If It Bleeds. So that was my big disappointment going into it from my side. So Stephen King didn't want to write that novel. He wanted to do something else with Holly Gibney, and he hasn't been writing a lot of supernatural novels recently. I think his most recent supernatural novel was probably The Outsider in 2018. I suppose there's Fairy Tale as well, if you want to count that. Fairy Tale Fairy Tale felt like he wanted to rewrite The Talisman, but maybe make it a little more boring. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but that's on its own little thing. It's his own little fantasy kick. As far as having like real villains and having a supernatural presence, I think the last one was The Outsider. Now, he's written some short stories, and in his most recent collection, You Like It Darker, there are some great short stories with supernatural elements, right? I think Rattlesnakes is like the best example of him using supernatural elements to really good effect. Rattlesnakes being the sequel to Cujo, which itself didn't have a supernatural element at all. But in novel form, he hasn't really leaned into the supernatural in quite a while, so he seems to be going away from that for his novels. However, he is working on the third book in the Talisman series, and he's already said it's going back to Midworld, so back in the Dark Tower realm. So maybe there'll be some supernatural elements there. That's what I'm hoping. But that's not the book Stephen King wanted to write with this. And so I went into it wanting it to be something else, because I feel Holly Gibney excels in those environments, and that's not what he wanted to write. So that's on me, right? However, I will say the book itself also was disappointing insofar as Holly didn't have to do a whole lot. Things happened around her, okay? And she did make some deductions. She did some like investigative work in the beginning, but everything she realized, all of her insights, the police realized on their own very quickly after she did. And none of them were breaking the case. None of them were monumental. Back up really quickly. What is the story about? There are two storylines happening. The first one is that there is a serial killer killing innocent people, and that's all you know. And so the scary thing about this antagonist is that He's just murdering random innocent people. So there's no way to track who he is. There's no way to follow a pattern because there is no pattern except that there are random people being murdered. And then the other storyline is a women's rights activist named Kate, who is going on a book tour, ostensibly, or really a speaking tour from city to city around the states. And she has a stalker that is following her and threatening her. And the threats seem valid, right? There's actual danger that is happening. And Holly Gibney ends up being hired to serve as a bodyguard to this woman and go on tour with her and travel with her throughout the U.S. to help keep her safe from the stalker. So these are the two storylines that are happening. Before Holly is hired to be a bodyguard, she is helping investigate the serial killer case. So her mind is working both cases at once. You know, even when she's serving as bodyguard, her real goal is to do the investigative work to find out who the stalker is, because that's the best kind of protection, right? If you can unmask the stalker and get ahead of them, then you don't have to try to physically protect anyone. So those are the two stories that are happening. And to be honest, Holly doesn't have a lot to do in either of them. Like I said, things happen around her. She reacts in interesting ways. She has some work to do. She does do some interesting, feats of logic. She does do some bodyguarding for what that's worth. And in the end, obviously, she figures things out and is critical to like the critical moment, the climactic scene, So she has something to do there. But throughout the novel, things are kind of happening around her, and anything that makes Holly special isn't really highlighted in this story. At least that's not true. Holly's personality and her character, that's highlighted. But her ability to engage in deductive reasoning and to investigate and to figure out what's going on and to be a lot more than she looks like from the outside, none of that is really exploited to any good means. Now, there's a lot of interior growth for Holly, which is what I loved about the story. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But as far as giving her things to do in the story, in terms of narrative, she doesn't do a whole lot. She's there and she's doing things, but they aren't as consequential to the plot as they could be because other people are doing the same things as her, more or less. You know what I mean? So her inner journey is interesting and exciting, but the narrative journey is just kind of mid, in my opinion. And then the other thing that was just disappointing is these antagonists were both boring. Like, they were not interesting at all. Now, yes, I would prefer a supernatural antagonist, but Stephen King has done human antagonists in many, many stories, going back to, the first Stephen King book I read was Misery, and then Gerald's Game. Well, Gerald's Game, I guess, had some supernatural elements. But you can look at his stories that don't have any supernatural elements at all, explicit or implicit, and they can be really terrifying and interesting, and their villains can be really interesting. Even the villains in Holly were interesting. There's a couple of senior citizen retired professors who decided that they needed to eat people to stay healthy. Like, they were wackadoodle in ways that were interesting and that were unpredictable. Both of the antagonists in this book are basically adults who had traumatic childhoods and didn't have the support or care necessary to navigate their traumatic childhoods. And as adults, they were triggered by one thing or another and groomed a little bit by one thing or another. And as a result of that, they've snapped and had essentially mental breakdowns and have chosen violence. It is like the least interesting thing. One of them is a religious extremist, the other isn't. So the religious extremist, that's King really showing the hypocrisy of people in power using it to hurt others. And that's one of the big themes that carries through all of King's work, right? He doesn't like bullies. He doesn't like people in power using it to exploit or abuse others. And so you see that with the religious extremist antagonist. But the other one, he just had a really bad childhood. And he hears like the voice of his father in his head criticizing him all the time. And as a result of that, that urges him to, be something else. And that something else is a violent serial killer. Those are just boring. They're not interesting. They don't give anything good for Holly to do with that. I will say, to give some credence to the thematic ideas of the story and to tie the antagonists to Holly's inner journey. In Holly, the novel Holly, she really had to deal with her mother and her childhood and the abuse she experienced, emotional abuse at the hands of her mother. And her mother passed away during the events of Holly, I believe. And so in this book, she constantly hears her mother's voice in her head as well, criticizing her, belittling her, saying she's not good enough, saying she's doing everything wrong. But she reacts to it in a way that denies the power over those traumatic memories, and she's able to, move beyond them and grow as a result of that. And so that is set in distinction to our antagonist, who is held back by his memories and held back by the trauma he experienced. Now, if you think about this too much, it can kind of feel like you're blaming the victim for, being abused and then not being able to have the resources or the necessary conditions to overcome that abuse and trauma. And so don't think about it too much, because I'm sure that is not what Stephen King intended. But I guess in that way, if you're going to give a little bit of credence, King was showing this parallel where both characters had emotionally abusive parents, but one of them, Holly, is able to look at that emotional abuse in the face now as an adult and say, no, I am better than this. I am better than when you say I am, and I can be a person that I am proud of being. Whereas the antagonist, Trig, he calls himself, isn't able to do that. So he does serve as a counterpoint to Holly in that way, I suppose, if you're being very generous. But I just wasn't impressed by either of the antagonists. So that also makes it disappointing, you know? I was impressed by the randomness of it and the danger that can happen when you have a serial killer, killing people for no reason and doing it quickly and becoming obsessed with it and enjoying it more than he thought he would. And so as a result of that, the murders are piling up very quickly, and there's no real ability to respond to it in a meaningful way because you have no context for who he's killing or why. I mean, you know why. He explains his overall reasoning in his missives, but he doesn't have any rationale between who he picks as a victim except that they're innocent. So that is frightening, right, as an idea, but as a narrative device, it only can go so far. Okay, so all I've done so far is complain, really, and I don't like complaining. So I want to talk about why I'm doing a review of this book, because I did enjoy this book, and there is a lot to enjoy about it. So first off, Stephen King's writing is as good as it always is. I really enjoy Stephen King's writing. He is not a literary master by design. He chooses to be simple. He chooses to be direct. He's talked about this before. He wants the writing to be approachable to everyone. He wants it to be simple, not in the way that it is unadorned, but that it is speaking to a common person. Because of that, the reading is very compulsive. It's very bingeable. Even though I wasn't overly excited by the antagonists, I didn't want to put the book down. As soon as I started it, I finished it in 2 days because I didn't want to stop reading it. So his writing has that effect, and he does it really well here. The pacing and the plotting, I think, work together with the writing and to make it really bingeable, like I said, really compulsive. And there is character growth. There is journey happening, right? Because his characters are great as always. That is where King excels. That is what I really enjoy reading King for, is how much he cares about character and how much he lets character guide the story that he's writing. And for all of my lack of enthusiasm for other parts of this novel, I think Holly's character does go on a good inner journey. She does have growth. She does stretch herself. She does do things that she didn't want to do or she didn't know she was capable of doing as she is becoming who she was meant to be, an independent private eye, doing her own work, being her own person. The reason she chooses to be a bodyguard, she even says is, well, this is something new. This is something I haven't done before, so I should see if I can do this, right? So that, I think, is interesting. And her going on this journey is compelling. Seeing her become more confident, seeing her overcome some of her demons and her doubts about herself, realizing that she is an integral part of numerous communities and she has a lot of people that care for her, that is all really compelling to see. So I really enjoyed Holly's growth in this. And the ancillary characters are all fun as well. You have recurring characters like Jerome and Barbara and Izzy, the cop, and all of them have things to do. Again, Jerome kind of gets the short shrift. At some point, he wrote a book and he became a best-selling author during the course of Holly, and you hear about it from like the sidelines, like he calls his sister and you hear about it that way, but he has very little presence in Holly. And in this one, he has a little more presence, but not a lot. Here he just has writer's block. So he doesn't have a lot to do, but a little bit more than he did in Holly, and you do see some growth and some emotional and experiential growth from him. Barbara, as always, you can tell King is also fascinated with Barbara. And in the Bill Hodges trilogy, she was young, right? She was not very prominent in that trilogy because she was like 8 or 9 years old only. So now she is in college or graduating college. Like her and Jerome are both either in college or graduating, like right around, the late teens, early 20s. And so they have more developed characters, both of them. Izzy, the cop, I think is interesting. She has more to do. And even though I'm not a big fan of the antagonists, we get to spend time from their POVs following them throughout the course of the story, and they both at least are interesting to spend time with. So all of the characters, the ancillary characters as well as Holly, I think have some sort of development and they're interesting. And I should also mention, maybe the most interesting character is the character of Kate, and then her assistant Corinne. So Kate is the women's rights activist that Holly is serving as bodyguard for. And what I really liked about this character is that she's pretty awful, actually. Her politics are great, and all of the characters, or at least all of the characters that we side with, appreciate her politics. She's very motivating to many, many people around the world and around the country. Like, that's her role, right? That's her job. But you meet her face to face, and she's kind of demanding and full of herself and not a great person. And you could say, from a meta point of view, that's a little bit misogynistic on King's part to make the most feminist character also the bitchiest character. But I don't think he was doing that. I think what he was doing was he was setting her up as a really great foil to Holly, because Holly's protecting this woman. And he's showing, first off, how your public face and your personal face aren't always the same thing. So this woman, her public face, everyone adores it, or they hate it, right? She's very polarizing because, people hate women in our country. And so misogyny and patriarchy are kind of the rule of the land. So anyone that is a vocal proponent of women's rights is still going to have haters. So unfortunately, that's the case. But otherwise, in this liberal circle, this woman, Kate, is celebrated, right? But you meet her face to face, and she's nothing like her public persona. And she's harsh, she is demanding, she's needy, and she has this sense of self-righteousness that she kind of uses to cover up maybe what would be her own kind of self-doubt. Whereas Holly is the opposite, right? Holly is never sure she's doing enough. And Holly doesn't like to be in public. She doesn't like to be forward facing. She wants to be behind the scenes. She wants to be invisible. And yet, when you do get her face to face, when you have a personal relationship with her, you love her. Everyone loves her. Everyone wants to spend time with her. And so she is the opposite of this woman. She looked up to this woman before going on this tour and protecting this woman. And now, as she goes on the tour, she says, I still respect this woman. I think she's a great thinker. I think she's doing really important work, but I also see that she's flawed. She isn't perfect. She isn't what she pretends to be or what she shows to the world. And I think that is an interesting decision from King, to make this character, who clearly is espousing a type of politics that King believes and agrees with. He takes her and makes her unlikable, right? And makes her unlikable and sets her up against Holly, who is the opposite in many ways. And so that was smart. I really liked it. And then she has an assistant who is a college student named Corinne, who is just very lovable. And of course, right away, Holly falls in love with this college student who looks up to Kate and is treated like garbage by Kate, essentially. And even Kate said she didn't expect her to stick around, because she knows that she goes through assistance because she recognizes that she rides everyone rough. She recognizes that she is an acquired taste in her personal life, but she's kind of proud of that. And so these two characters, Kate and Corinne, were also really well-rounded. They're interesting, and they were maybe the interactions between Kate and Holly were some of the, not necessarily explicit interactions, but just the dynamic between the two of them were some of the more interesting ideas and parts of the book. So as usual, King does really well with the characters. And as I mentioned, I think the plotting and pacing are good. It moves really quickly, and it doesn't go off on tangents, which King is known for doing. And I like King going off on tangents. I'm happy to read a 1,000-page King book, half of which probably doesn't make any sense or doesn't really relate to the main story. Like, I'm fine with that. I actually enjoy that because I do like his writing so much, and I fall into his writing. It feels comfortable. It feels like I'm going home. It feels like I'm sitting in an old armchair in front of a fireplace, just like, in a safe zone. So I'm happy to go off on tangents for hundreds of pages. But he doesn't do that in this book. This book is pretty tight. Pacing just works really well. And the two storylines intersect in a way that feels natural, I suppose. I mean, it feels a little convenient, like narratively convenient, because there's no thematic resonance between these two storylines that needs them to come together. But there is narrative convenience that doesn't feel shoehorned in. It doesn't feel like it's forced. And so I appreciate that. Sometimes, King often uses more than one storyline. And sometimes when they come together, it really feels like he has to work to make these two things intersect. But here, due to the nature of these two stories and just the way both of them have these moving narratives, it makes sense for them to intersect the way they do. Even if it doesn't have a lot of thematic resonance, it does have narrative purpose. So that felt convincing. I will say, in the interviews where he talked about this book before it was released, he mentioned that his original draft had 3 separate storylines, and he was combining this women's rights activist who is being stalked as well as the serial killer, and then a third storyline as well. And he was having trouble with the book because it was overwritten and he couldn't get it to work. And then I don't know if it was his wife or his agent or someone looked at it and said, this is too much, you have to pull out one of these storylines. And then when he got rid of that third storyline and focused in on 2, he said that's what made the book kind of come to life and come together in a meaningful way. And I can imagine that if there was a third storyline, it just would have been too much. So I think by eliminating that storyline in the writing process, he was able to make these 2 storylines you have weave in and out in a way that feels organic and you feel invested in both storylines. So the amount of time he spends on one versus the other and the way he goes back and forth is a useful plot device to keep the reader engaged, and he does it well. It is finely crafted in that way, that you always want to know what's going to happen next. And as soon as you build up to a point of tension, he switches to a different point of view to the other storyline to keep, hooks in you. And he does it well. So he knows his craft well, and he does a good job plotting, pacing, and pulling the reader into the story and keeping them on tenterhooks the whole time. So I really appreciated the pacing of this story and the plotting of it. As for the story itself, I mean, it was fine. It wasn't particularly interesting. because the antagonists weren't particularly interesting, and they did not really serve as good obstacles for Holly. So you didn't get to see the best parts of Holly. So in that way, it wasn't really exciting or overwhelming. But it was fine. It was compelling. You wanted to know who the bad guys were. King has said he doesn't like writing mysteries because he doesn't like doing too much plotting before he starts writing. He doesn't want to plan where a book is going to go. He likes character, and he likes letting the characters create the plot, and then he goes back and revises afterwards. So if you're doing a proper mystery, a whodunit, you need to be able to plant seeds and clues throughout the whole thing, and you have to plot it out in a way that he does not appreciate. He's even said the amount of plotting he had to do to prepare for this was more than he enjoys doing. But so because of that, the way he writes mysteries is you know who the killer is right from the beginning quite often, and you're spending time with the killer. Now, the actual identity of the killer is hidden from you in this one because he goes by the nickname Trig. You don't find out who he really is until, near the end when his actual name is revealed, and so you understand how he fits into this kind of tapestry of different characters that are involved in the story. But the stories are never constructed in such a way where you could solve the mystery as a reader, right? So it's not a conventional mystery in that way. You as a reader have no hope of solving the mystery before the characters. Sometimes you're given more information than they are, but not enough that can solve the mystery. You don't have clues that you can pick up on that can be definitive in any way. And so you're along for the ride with the protagonists. And that's fine. That's the way King likes to write mysteries, and he does it well. But because of that, just the type of narrative tension is different, right? And the type of reader engagement is different. It's more of an emotional engagement than it is an intellectual engagement, which is what I think King excels at. So even though the story was fine, it wasn't super interesting, it was crafted in such a way to invoke a type of emotional engagement on the part of the reader to really make you feel involved in the story. And yet it didn't have the kind of intellectual overanalyzing type of engagement that other types of mystery stories have. So, that's going to be up to you what kind of mystery you like. Do you want to be solving a mystery and having all the clues in front of you, like a traditional Golden Age mystery novel? Or do you want to have the emotional investment in the character's journey that just happened to be along for the ride during this mystery or investigation or whatever it may be? Your mileage will vary depending on what kind of story you like. But here it's more of that latter camp where it's an emotional investment, but you're not engaging in the actual clue finding. You're not actually doing the work yourself as a reader. There's no hope of you solving the mystery. You do, of course, find out who the killer is before our protagonists do. And as a result of that, you get the chance to see your protagonists put themselves in the line of fire, but they don't know they're doing it. So that's another way he kind of manipulates your emotions, where you're along with them for the first part of the journey, not knowing who the bad guy is, being as in the dark about everything. And then things are revealed to you that aren't revealed to the main characters. So you see them putting themselves in more danger that they aren't aware. So you see the pieces being put into place before they do. And so that builds up the emotional tension, right? So King is really good at that. He does that well. The overall story, it didn't wow me, but the pieces fit together really well, and it's well crafted. And it was fun to read, right? Which is the point. As for ideas in this book, King is pretty blunt with a lot of his ideas. He takes a subtext and he makes it text. And so having your main character be a women's rights activist who is talking about bodily autonomy, and having her be stalked by a religious fanatic who is a hate monger, King is putting his politics pretty front and center and saying this is something he feels important. And something I'll say that I think is really telling is that in the acknowledgments of the book at the end, King lists the names of people that were murdered who in their support of women's rights and women's bodily autonomy, starting with Dr. James Gunn, who is an abortion provider, and he was murdered in 1993 by a pro-life, quote-unquote pro-life activist. And he lists over a dozen names of people who were murdered in the right of protecting bodily autonomy. And so he clearly cares about this. And, having his bad guy be a religious fanatic, that's, again, one of King's go-to bad guys, because King doesn't like bullies. That's what it comes down to. If you look at one underlying principle of King's ethos is that he doesn't like bullies. He doesn't like people that are given power due to their position in society and then use that power to hurt others, to exploit others, or to enrich themselves, or some combination thereof. So, you often see police officers or politicians or judges or parents or religious leaders as the antagonists, because those are people that, due to their position in society, have been given some sort of power, and then when they choose to use that to harm others, that pushes them over a line for King to make them almost inhuman. So he doesn't like bullies. So having religious extremists be his bad guys, at least one of his bad guys in this novel, is very much very Stephen King, But it works because he's showing what is the difference between being open-minded and small-minded, and his commitment to having an open-minded experience of the world. And also, I mean, knowing a little bit about King's family shows you that he himself doesn't like hate religious people. I mean, his daughter, King famously has two writer sons, Joe Hill and Owen King, but his oldest child, Naomi, is queer. She is a disability activist, and she's an ordained minister. I think a Congregationalist minister, I'm not quite sure. But so he obviously doesn't have anything against religion and spirituality. He has things against bullies, and religious fanatics and religious leaders are often people that are given power and they use it to hurt others. So that is one of his big bugaboos, and that is present here. In addition to the right to kind of bodily autonomy and the right to choose your own destiny, that he is talking about some other ideas that are a little more subtle, though again, King isn't really subtle. But some other ideas are about realizing your own self-worth, right? Overcoming your own demons, overcoming your own doubts, and challenging yourself in a way that chooses to push yourself. So you see all of our kind of most important characters, so Holly, as well as Jerome and Barbara, and even Izzy, the detective, all have instances in their storylines where they choose to push themselves out of their comfort zone to do something that they didn't think they could do. And because of that, they grow as a character. So challenging yourself, realizing your self-worth, having a sense of confidence, realizing that you have the support of family and friends, and leaning into that relationship you have with others, into that relationship that's caring and loving and supportive, realizing that is a source of strength and not a source of weakness. These are all things that are very common themes for Stephen King novels, and he leans into them here, and he does it to good effect. That's kind of the heartwarming aspect of any Holly Gibney story, is that she's leaning into what it means to have emotional growth and what it means to develop as a person, and realizing that, you may be small and from the outside not have a very commandeering presence, and people may not give you the benefit of the doubt or not expect many things of you. That doesn't have to hold you back. That doesn't have to be something that defines who you are as a person. And so you see Holly growing through that, and you see the other characters grow through that as well. So that is, I guess, another thematic idea that Stephen King brings to this novel. Look, I think that's all I have to say. I enjoyed the novel. It was fun. It was very Stephen King. It was very compulsive. Once you start reading it, you feel comfortable. You fall into his rhythm of this heavy-handed foreshadowing, setting up atmosphere and gloom. Like at the end of a chapter, he'll say something like, she was finally excited to attend the party. Little did she know she would never get the chance. Like this kind of thing that he always does. And it just feels natural if you've read a lot of Stephen King. So this doesn't feel exceptional in Stephen King's body of work. The ideas and the themes are, nothing that are really deep or complicated, but they're very heartfelt. They're very genuine. The character work is great. The story itself is fine. It pulls you along. It's interesting enough. The antagonists could be a lot more interesting. They kind of hold the story back a little bit because they're so boring, and because they're kind of boring, they don't give Holly a lot to do. But Holly herself is always a fun character to spend time with. I enjoyed it. If you like Stephen King's work in general, I think you'll enjoy this. If you like mysteries, this is a fun mystery novel. Again, you're not going to solve the mystery, but you are going to have an emotional investment in the mystery, as opposed to an analytical or intellectual investment. And it's a fun ride in that regard. And it's late stage Stephen King. Like, it is kind of what it is. If you're willing to be open to it, then you'll have a fun time reading it. I think that's all there is to it. I will also say it was really nice, the very end of the book. He mentions, there's a performing arts arena, and he mentions other acts that are going to be performing there, because there's a whole storyline with Barbara performing and meeting a performer. So he mentions other acts that are going to be performing there in the future, and he name checks the Dropkick Murphys, which is a Celtic punk band from Boston who've been around for maybe 3 decades or so. And I just thought that was really nice. I know King doesn't listen to a Celtic punk band from Boston. He's a very rockabilly kind of guy, but I grew up in central Massachusetts, and then I did my graduate work outside of Boston. And whenever I am feeling homesick, which isn't often, but whenever I am, hearing a little bit of a Boston accent brings me back home. And literally, if you listen to anything by the Dropkick Murphys, whether they're just talking or their music, it brings me back home right away. There's a little bit of home there. And so that was a nice little addition, just for me. I don't know if anyone else cares about it at all, but hearing the Dropkick Murphys mentioned is nice. Plus, they're releasing a new album soon, and their new song is really great, and it's about workers' rights and standing up for people that have less power than you. So, I'm always going to support that as well. But that is just an aside. So, I'll end it there, since I am now on my own kind of tangent. I'd love to know, have you read this? What did you think of it? Where does it fit in your estimation of Stephen King's work? Do you like his late stage work, or do you want him to go back to the grittier, darker, almost more unhinged work that he did before his road accident when he was almost killed, which is one of the big changing points, right? In a lot of his work, becomes more introspective and less supernatural in the mid 2000s. So what do you think of that? And I just love to hear your thoughts or ideas about King, about Holly Gibney, about any of this down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.